Chapter 9, Section 3, Social and Cultural Changes. Building background. After World War II, African Americans began to play a larger role in the nation's cultural activities. The success of black artists, actors, writers, and athletes brought to the nation's attention the achievements of African Americans throughout the country. Returning from war. American soldiers returning home from World War II found many new opportunities available to them. Even before the war had ended, President Roosevelt had signed what became known as the GI Bill, an act designed to help soldiers attending college or receive advanced training in a career. The bill also provided loans to returning soldiers who wished to buy farms or homes. The GI Bill and higher education. Though the GI Bill was intended to apply equally to all returning soldiers, some African American soldiers found it difficult to take full advantage of the bill for various reasons. Some could not afford to do so, as the grants often were not large enough to provide for families. Many ex-soldiers had no choice but to stay home and look for work rather than attend college. In addition, some prospective students faced discrimination from college admissions boards and the Department of Veterans Affairs, an organization created to help meet the needs of returning soldiers. Even with these obstacles, black college enrollment did increase greatly after the war. Not only were more black students enrolling in college, but more institutions of higher learning were opening their doors to black students. Still, about half of these students were enrolled in historically black colleges and universities. In the depressed economy that followed World War II, donations to private African American colleges decreased. Concerned, Dr. Frederick Patterson, then president of Tuskegee Institute, wrote to his peers to inquire if they were faced with the same difficulties. When he learned that they were, Patterson proposed a solution. He suggested that the schools collectively appeal to the nation for donations. A year later, in April 1944, the United Negro College Fund, UNCF, was created to give financial support to African American students pursuing a higher education. With support from President Roosevelt and John D. Rockefeller Jr., among others, the first campaign was a resounding success. Together, the 27 founding institutions raised 3 times as much money as they had raised independently the previous year. Confronting racism. Although racism and discrimination continued after World War II, the federal government did make an effort to end it. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued an executive order that was intended to end segregation in the military. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be no equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Harry S. Truman, Executive Order 9981, July 26, 1948. Despite some resistance, the armed forces began the slow process of integration. At first, blacks were admitted into the armed forces on the basis of a quota system, and many continued to serve in segregated units. Military segregation officially ended in 1954 when the Secretary of Defense declared that the last remaining all-black unit had been disbanded. The push for equality. As the government was taking the first steps toward ending discrimination in this country, many African Americans were striving on their own to win recognition for their abilities and talents. They hoped to use their newfound recognition to gain acceptance for African Americans throughout the country. African American athletes. In 1 week, Jesse Owens, the son of a sharecropper and grandson to a slave, accomplished what no Olympian had ever achieved before. He won 4 gold medals in track and field in the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, Germany, then under Nazi rule. Owens had not only proved himself the fastest man in the world, he had, before Adolf Hitler's own eyes, crushed the myth of white supremacy. Another popular athlete was Joe Louis. Known as the Brown Bomber, Louis became the world heavyweight boxing champion in 1937, a title that he would hold on to until 1949. His first professional loss was to a German boxer named Max Schmeling in 1936. Louis faced off against Schmeling in a rematch in 1938 and won. At the same time, many Americans viewed this fight as a symbol of the struggle between U.S. democracy and German Nazism. To this day, Louis is regarded by many as the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. What Joe Louis had done for African Americans just before World War II famed boxer Jack Johnson did in the years before World War I. Johnson was the first black man to win international recognition as a sports figure when he became boxing's world heavyweight champion in 1908. Marian Anderson and Eleanor Roosevelt. Meanwhile, African Americans continued to demonstrate their persistence and commitment to excellence in areas such as education and entertainment. One of the most public supporters of equality for African Americans was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. A personal friend of Mary McLeod Bethune, Roosevelt helped Bethune gain influence with the government. When Eleanor Roosevelt was photographed walking with two black Howard University ROTC cadets, African Americans around the country circulated the image as an example of Roosevelt's commitment to her belief in promoting equal rights. Renowned concert singer Marian Anderson is another talented African American who won the admiration of public figures such as Roosevelt. In 1939, Anderson attempted to schedule a booking at the famous Constitution Hall. However, the conservative group that owned the building, the Daughters of the American Revolution, refused her permission to do so. Roosevelt was so upset by the racial snub that she resigned from the DAR in protest. Anderson ended up performing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. instead. The performance became the most famous of her career. A host of notables, including the First Lady, attended the concert, which drew a crowd of 75,000 people. African Americans in the arts. As influential as African Americans were in sports and other fields, nowhere was their influence felt more than in the arts. From music to film to literature, black artists made major contributions to American culture in the 1930s and 1940s. The swing era. In the 1930s, a new type of music had captured the attention of the nation. Called swing, this music was a type of jazz that featured complicated, carefully planned orchestrations. Among the pioneers of swing music were many prominent African Americans. Edward Duke Ellington was one of the top creative geniuses of the Jazz Age, as the period was often called. In the early 1920s, Ellington made his way to New York and began working with a band called the Washingtonians. By 1927, Ellington and his band had a permanent gig at the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. For more than 50 years, Ellington would perform elegantly in top hat and tails, leading his band in numbers that he had written. His compositions won fame for displaying one musical innovation after another. In 1943, for example, he interwove jazz into the traditional concert format in his smash hit, Black, Brown, and Beige. A popular trend in swing music was the introduction of scat, a form of singing that uses random syllables rather than distinct words. Among the masters of this form of singing was black bandleader Cab Calloway. Scat features prominently in his biggest hit, Minnie the Moocher, released in 1931. Another popular black bandleader was William Count Basie. A brilliant piano player, Basie formed a band that became well known for its lively playing and the excellent recordings they made. In addition to their own music, Count Basie and his band won fame for inviting great vocalists to perform with them. Among the famous African Americans who performed with Count Basie and his band was Billie Holiday, considered by many to be one of the greatest female jazz singers ever. Louis Armstrong of New Orleans was another famous musician and band leader. Known as a phenomenal trumpet player, Armstrong, nicknamed Satchmo, toured the country with his band, selling out performances everywhere. He continued to play trumpet and sing into the 1960s, even knocking the Beatles out of the #1 spot on the charts with his release of Hello, Dolly in 1964. African Americans on stage. African Americans also made great contributions to theater and film. For example, Paul Robeson, a Columbia Law School graduate, won great fame for his dramatic roles on stage. In New York, Robeson spent much of his spare time with the black literary crowd, which also included such liberal white writers and artists as Carl Van Vechten and Eugene O'Neill. Before long, O'Neill asked him to take the lead role in his new play, All God's Children Got Wings. The daring play immediately became the center of a furious controversy because its theme was interracial marriage. Robeson was an activist who openly criticized racism. He was later blacklisted in the 1940s for his refusal to deny his suspected communist leanings. Black female playwrights of the period examined such issues as lynching, superstition, poverty, and ignorance. Mae Miller's 1933 play Nails and Thorns deals with the mob killing of a black man who is mentally handicapped. African American culture and black historical figures were also topics of examination. Shirley Graham was a composer, playwright, and biographer, among other things. Her 1932 opera, Tom Tom, is credited by some as the first opera written by an African American woman. African Americans in film. By the 1930s, African Americans were coming to more prominence in the movie industry. Though criticized by some for playing racial stereotypical roles, Hattie McDaniel won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. She was the first African American to win an Oscar, as well as the first African American to be nominated. Positive leading roles for African Americans in films, however, remain the exception. Lena Horne, a talented singer and actor, was one of the most popular African American entertainers of the 1940s and 1950s. She was the first African American actor to sign a long-term contract with a major movie studio, MGM. A pioneer in the entertainment industry, she broke down racial barriers by refusing to play the subservient roles usually reserved for black actresses at that time. The studio, unwilling to risk losing the mostly segregated Southern market, cast her in scenes that could be cut easily when shown in Southern theaters. Still, Horne appealed to both black and white audiences, and was the country's highest-paid black actor in the mid-1940s. African American contributions to art and literature. Black artists, writers, and poets also made a great impression during this period. One such artist was Jacob Lawrence. He was encouraged from an early age to pursue his interest in art and African American history, subjects that are evident in his many paintings, prints, and murals. In 1941, Lawrence completed his best-known series of paintings, The Migration of the Negro. Black writers and poets also made a great impression during this period. One talented writer of the 1930s and 1940s was Richard Wright. In 1940, he wrote Native Son, a telling commentary on racism in American society. The story of a young black man indicted for murder in Chicago, Native Son became a bestseller. So did his equally passionate Black Boy, published in 1945, which told of Wright's own experiences with prejudice as a young African-American man growing up in the South under Jim Crow laws. The stirring lyrical poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks so moved readers that she became the first African-American poet to win a Pulitzer Prize. She won the prestigious award in 1950 for her book Annie Allen, whose poems loosely chronicle the life of an African-American woman growing up in Chicago. Another prominent black author of the day was Ralph Ellison. His novel Invisible Man won the National Book Award in 1953. A fictionalized autobiography, it tells the story of a young black man who feels overlooked by society because of his race. Ellison continued to win acclaim for his work. He was also a skilled musician, photographer, and professor.